What's up, everybody? Good afternoon. Hope you guys are doing well. And I am doing everything I can on this channel to dissect the Pete Carroll firing. And yes, I am calling it a firing because I believe that's what it is from every possible angle on this channel in terms of what Pete leaves behind, what is ahead for whoever is the next coach, who the next head coach might be, etc., etc. But there's one angle I haven't really touched on yet on this channel that I feel like needs to be discussed. There's one element to this Pete Carroll firing that I feel like needs to be dove into at least a little bit. I'm not going to go super deep into this because at the end of the day, I don't think this is something that is going to happen, but I do acknowledge the fact that it is possible that something could happen here. I'm talking about trading Pete Carroll. So the way the Seahawks have done things, they have fired Pete Carroll without actually firing Pete Carroll because he remains with the organization for now in an advisory role. However, we know from Pete Carroll's own comments that he did not want to stop coaching and that it was, like I said, a firing with extra steps. So it's not like he's walking away. It's not like he feels like he can't do this anymore. He just can't do it here in Seattle anymore because the powers that be don't want him to be doing it anymore. So that creates a circumstance here where there is a person in the Seahawks front office who wants to continue to be a head coach but can't do it here, but has, because of the way we've done this, remained under contract with the Seattle Seahawks. So therefore, if Pete Carroll wants to continue to be a coach somewhere in the NFL, he will either have to wait for his contract to expire or he'll have to be traded. And in this video, I want to talk about that latter scenario. Is there any possibility of the Seattle Seahawks trading Pete Carroll to another team for assets? Trading coaches in the NFL is something that very rarely happens. I think it's happened like 3 or 4 times in the last 25 years or so. We saw it happen with Bill Belichick. We saw it happen with John Gruden. We saw it happen with Sean Payton recently. I feel like trading a head coach is the ultimate example of trying to hit a bullet with another bullet while riding a horse while blindfolded. It's just really hard to thread that needle to where the coach goes somewhere he wants to go. The team that is trading for him is actually a team that would want said coach, and they can make it work financially and they can make it work in terms of draft picks because coaches tend to be very expensive when you trade for them. So, is this a realistic possibility for the Seattle Seahawks and Pete Carroll? Could a trade happen? We got this tweet earlier from Richard Sherman on X talking about how Pete to the Chargers would be a match made in heaven. If Pete got traded to the Los Angeles Chargers, that would be the perfect match between a team that needs somebody like a Pete Carroll and a coach who needs a situation like what the Chargers can offer. The Chargers already have a really good franchise quality quarterback in place in Justin Herbert. They just kind of need a lot of other things, and they also need some culture building, is the way people put it. Like Sherman even says it in this tweet. Pete Carroll would change the culture and put more people in seats than ever before. We also know that Pete Carroll is one of the very few guys in the history of the world that made Los Angeles really like football. He, during his time as the head coach of USC, invigorated that city for football stuff more than maybe just about anybody else who's ever lived. So it would be kind of a homecoming for him to coach an NFL team in the same area where he made his bones as a college football coach. So it's definitely an interesting idea. It's a team that is going to need a somewhat of a rebuild, I think, because they have so many expensive and semi-expensive pieces that just aren't really working out. They have a lot of guys who are highly drafted and highly touted and young, but could go one way or the other, like Quentin Johnston, who knows what he is at this point. Zion Johnson, is he worth the top pick they spent on him? They need a new center with Lindsley retiring. Asante Samuel Jr. looks like a bust so far. Kenneth Murray Jr., the linebacker, looks like a bust as well. They've got a lot of work to be done in LA, but Pete Carroll is a guy who, if he really wants to do this for a few more years, might make some sense. And I'm going to pull up the document that I had in a video I posted a couple hours ago. If you take a look at some of these other head coach openings, you've got the Titans, Raiders, Chargers, like we talked about. You've got the Commanders, you've got the Falcons, you've got the Panthers, and then you've got, now we know officially, the Patriots. Would Pete Carroll work for any of those other teams on top of just the Chargers? Because the problem with the Chargers, as I see it, is that is one of the worst ownership situations in the entire league, maybe the worst. I think that even the ownership situation we have in Seattle or the ownership situation in Las Vegas are both better than the Dean Spanos situation, because not only is Spanos a bad owner, but it's also probably being sold soon, which, well, look, don't get me wrong, getting rid of Spanos would be good, but who knows what the new ownership is going to want? Who knows who it's going to be? Who knows if that's even a good thing? So that's kind of my hang up there. Would a place like the Titans or even a place like the Commanders make a little more sense for him? I kind of feel like the Titans are not going to move off of Mike Vrabel just to bring in a Pete Carroll. I kind of feel like they would view that as a lateral move. I think they moved off of Vrabel partially so they could get somebody young and hip and exciting and probably a little more offensive minded than Pete Carroll. I also kind of feel the same about the Commanders. They just moved off of a old-fashioned coach who actually has a lot in common with Carroll. They both defensive first guys. They both love linebackers. They both had a very intense connection with a superstar inside linebacker of their era, with Kuechly with Rivera, and then Wagner with Carroll. But I don't know why they would go from Rivera to Carroll necessarily. The Chargers thing is interesting because they tried to go young and hip with Staley, and it was a disaster for the most part. So they might say, okay, let's pull it way back and get somebody in here to try to build the culture up. I think the Falcons is actually very interesting because they have such a good roster in place. They just need a quarterback. And say whatever you want to say about Carroll, but he does have a pretty good track record with quarterbacks, especially quarterbacks that a lot of other people didn't want. People didn't really want Russell Wilson. They viewed him as not being a real pro quarterback. He got a really good career out of Russell Wilson by hook or by crook. And of course, the Geno Smith stuff. Geno Smith's career was over, and Carroll turned him into a viable quality NFL starter. And they've got a good ownership situation, too. They're reasonably flexible with what they can do with their roster. I think the Falcons is actually very interesting. Carolina would be interesting if not for the disaster they have in owner right now, but I think that's another place that even if they had a better owner would probably be looking to somebody young and hip to grow old with Bryce Young, not necessarily somebody like Carroll. New England, I don't know if they want to go from the second oldest coach in the league to the oldest coach in the league, so I don't know if I really am into that. I will say it's a great ownership situation, right? Ownership situation because of Kraft, but I don't know. I don't see it as much there. I see it more with the Falcons and I see it more with the Chargers than I do with anybody else. But the big question is, because I can talk about all these things from the assumption that Pete Carroll is desirable and that Pete Carroll would be an asset that teams covet. Is that true? Is that the case? It depends on who you ask. If you're somebody like Richard Sherman, if you're somebody like one of his former players, if you're somebody who really liked Pete Carroll, there's some really valuable stuff that he has to offer, sure. Now, I think that there is a perception among many people that Pete Carroll was doing a bad job recently and doesn't have a lot left. That's certainly the perception that I personally have. I just don't know what perception is being shared by owners and general managers across the NFL right now. So this one's kind of tough for me to judge because I know where I personally stand. If I owned a team or was the general manager of a team like the Titans or the Falcons or the Chargers, I wouldn't want to trade for Carroll. Remember, trading for a coach tends to be very expensive because if you look at the history of it, guys like Belichick, who got traded, Gruden, who got traded, and now Sean Payton, they're going for like first round pick plus. Now, Carroll's older than the average coach that gets traded, but you're still probably looking at a pretty serious asset to get Carroll. Second round pick minimum, maybe a first round pick. You don't see coaches go for super cheap these days. So if Carroll is actually out there to be traded for, I imagine at minimum you're giving up a second round pick and quite possibly more Because again, if you're trading for him, that means you covet him, and if you covet him, that means the Seahawks are going to upcharge you as much as they can. That's just the business, right? And also, I wonder, would the Seahawks actually do that? We've seen this with Belichick. Now, Belichick is 10 times the coach that Pete Carroll will ever be. I'm not comparing the two in terms of quality. Belichick's the greatest coach who ever coached a coach of a coach in the history of this league. But we saw earlier today that the Patriots decided to part ways with Belichick instead of trading him because they felt like it was the right thing to do out of respect to all that he had accomplished. They didn't want to force him into a new situation. They wanted him to pick his next situation. So maybe we would end up applying the same logic to Carroll and say, look, we're not going to trade you unless we can find the perfect trade scenario where you're going exactly where you want to go, because we just feel like that would be disrespectful. And arguably, trading him at all is kind of disrespectful. So I don't know. This one's interesting. To me, I think that Pete Carroll could provide some real value to the right team. The Chargers is a situation where I could see it, but I'm just not convinced that the perception of Carroll as a coach right now is good enough for a team to be willing to actually give up significant capital to get. Again, you might be looking at giving up your first round pick, and the Chargers pick in the top 5. I don't think they're doing that. So, second round pick plus third round pick, would they do that? I'm not really feeling it. The best I can say is that ownership situation's a mess, and Dean Spanos would probably just do it and turn his brain off football-wise for the next couple years. He could figure that, hey, I'll let Pete Carroll run the show so I don't have to think about this team that I don't care about anymore. But I don't know. There's a lot that needs to happen. But what do you guys think? Let me know down below. I'm going to see you guys later. Another video coming in a couple hours. Go Hawks. Do you think something could be in the works with a Pete Carroll trade to another team?